The regathering of Israel. Let's start in Isaiah chapter 11. The context, of course, in Isaiah 11, as we've seen previously, is that this is the messianic reign of Jesus. And then we pick up in verse 10. Then in that day, which day? The messianic reign, the nations will resort to the root of Jesse meaning the messianic line. Jesse was the father of David, who's the prototype of Messiah, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. It will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people. Right here, people say, Isaiah 11, this is referring in context, if you read the full context before and after, this is talking about the Exodus motif, which you see throughout the book of Isaiah. So when it says the second time, the first regathering was in the Pharaoh occupying the people, and then they were gathered out of Egypt. The second regathering, of course, would be the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. So this isn't a prophecy about the future. This is something that was fulfilled in the past. I've got big problems with that. For one, the context is the end of human history. That's what we're seeing here in Isaiah chapter 11. When it refers to the second time is saying, we already know about the regathering under the Babylonian exile. This is speaking, of course, in context about a future regathering in the Messianic age. Does this refer to the Exodus? No. The remnant spoken of here in Isaiah chapter 11 is a remnant. Okay, you got the nation, and then the remnant within the nation was the Exodus, where all of the Jewish people were taken out of Egypt, and the 10 plagues, and Pharaoh let my people go, and they were taken out into the promised land. Was that a remnant of the people? No, that's not a remnant of the people. Instead, that was all the people. So to say that the Lord will come again a second time to get a remnant of his people, the first time cannot be the Exodus under Moses, because that was a remnant. So too, we see in the Babylonian exile, 50,000 people were regathered. There was a regathering in the 6th century BC. Remember, the Jewish people in Judah were spread into Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Then they were brought back into Israel from where? From the globe? From all the surrounding nations? No. They were brought back from where? From Babylon. 50,000 people, according to Nehemiah chapter 7. And this isn't in dispute. This isn't part that's in dispute. The part that's in dispute is this referring to the Exodus motif? If we actually look at the verbiage, the language, we see that this is referring to all of the nations. That's why we read in verse 11, the very next verse, these will be people who remain from Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and the islands of the sea. In case we didn't cover them all, as far as we can go here. So let's try and capture this here as we look at Assyria, that's modern-day Iraq. In 1948, there were 150,000 Jewish people in Iraq. Today, as of 2021, there are less than 5. With me? Egypt, in Pathros, in 1948, there were 75,000 people of Jewish ethnicity in Egypt and Pathros. Today, less than 10. What about Cush? This could either be modern-day Ethiopia or more likely the Sudan. In 1948, there were 1,000 Jewish people. Today, there are 0 Jews in the Sudan. They don't exist. What about Elam and Shinar? This is modern-day Iran. In 1948, there were 100,000 Jewish people. Today, roughly 8,300 Jewish people in these territories. Hamath, which is modern-day Syria, 15,000 Jewish people in 1948. Again, today, none. There are none. Do you see what we're looking at here? A flood of people from all of the nations specifically predicted in Isaiah chapter 11 are flooding back into Israel, the modern day second time regathering. And if this isn't enough, the islands of the sea. So, we read in verse 12, he will lift up a standard for the nations, this is Messiah, and assemble the banished ones of Israel. He will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth, islands of the sea, Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Elam, Shinar, etc., 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 and the four corners of the earth. Now you could say that this is perspectival language, referring, of course, from Isaiah, looking out at the known world at the time, sure. But the four corners of the earth, let me say, at the very least, needs to refer to beyond the scope of Babylon. Verse 13, I'm using the NLT because the NASB is very wooden here. At last, at this point, the jealousy between Israel, the northern part of the civil war, Israel, and Judah, the southern part of the nation, that jealousy will end. They will not be rivals anymore. Verse 14, they will join forces to stoop down on Philistia to the west. Together they will attack and plunder the nations to the east. This never happened. Israel and Judah were separated. Messiah certainly hasn't come. Being regathered from all the nations of the earth, the four corners of the globe, the islands of the sea, hasn't happened yet. Yet we're seeing here, this is predictive of when? The end of human history. At the end of history, this is going to come about. So our observations are these in Isaiah chapter 11. If we were to do a deep dive, deep tissue study of Isaiah 11, verse 1, Messiah is there. Verse 4, he's ruling over the entire globe. There's a restored animal kingdom. The baby lies down with the cobra and sticks its hand in the viper's nest. The lion lies down with the lamb. There's some kind of peace on earth that we can't really describe yet. This hasn't happened yet. There's a worldwide knowledge of God. That hasn't happened yet in verse 9 of Isaiah 11. Then we read in verses 11 and 12, God is going to regather all of the Jewish people from around the world into the geographic location, the real estate of Israel. And then Israel will be one unified nation. No more civil war, no more infighting. It's over. Now, when we look at this, has all of this happened yet? Of course not. I don't put little babies in front of the cobra's nest, right? There's not a worldwide knowledge of God. What we're arguing so far is just simply this, the very conservative statement that God is in the process of fulfilling verses 11 and 12 in our own day. Let me repeat that. He is in the process of fulfilling, bringing back the Jewish people from the various nations. In other words, do we expect God to snap his cosmic fingers and all the Jewish people are teleported back to the nation of Israel? Well, maybe you do expect that. Well, your expectations are wrong. What we see here is that God is filling full this prophecy to bring them back, and that takes a process of time, a period of time. Jesus taught this as well. Luke 21:21, just to give you some context, this is referring to Jerusalem. Those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city of Jerusalem must leave. This is referring, of course, to the prediction that there would be the surrounding of the city by the armies of Rome, Vespasian in particular, and they would destroy the city of Jerusalem and the temple between the period of AD 66 to AD 70. So Jesus is saying, when you see the Roman army surrounding the city, don't walk, run. Get out. Incidentally, we saw that this was fulfilled. The Christians living in Jerusalem at the time, based on Luke chapter 21, fled the city and got out before the Jewish war. Verse 24, they will be led captive into all the nations. How many nations? All nations. The Jews there will be enslaved and sent out into all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The operative word there is until. Worldwide spread of the Jewish people from Jerusalem. This is in the Jewish war. There's no dispute about that. The dispute is until. Until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And at that moment, whenever that epoch of time is fulfilled, they'll come back. This is precisely what we've seen in the 20th century. Why is it that when we turn on the news, all of the Middle Eastern conflict centers around Israel? Israel, the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, ? Being fulfilled, yet to be fulfilled? I don't know. I'm not one to be a stickler on this. I'm just saying that what we're seeing is that we're in the process, at the very least, of this being fulfilled. Let me give you one more. Jeremiah 31, verse 35. The context here is the aberrant, abhorrent practices of the Jewish people. Child sacrifice, ritual prostitution, rampant idolatry, murder, torture, slavery, everything you can think of. And it's in this context that God says through Jeremiah, "Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name." Catch this. "If this fixed order departs before me," what's the fixed order? Sun, moon, and stars. "Then, if the sun, moon, and stars disappear, then the offspring of Israel also will cease from being a nation before me." Is it true that God in the Old Testament would discipline his people, would judge his people, and they would be dispersed and brought back together? Of course that's true. But ultimately, would he ever abandon the nation of Israel? Yes. Yes. In fact, if you want to get rid of the Jewish people, very easy. If you want to get rid of the Jews, simple, very simple. All you have to do is destroy the sun, the moon, and the stars. Okay? As one theologian writes that I'm particularly fond of, he says, "Isn't it interesting that every time the Jewish people are persecuted and someone tries to kill them, they get a holiday out of it?" The Exodus, where they were trying to be killed by the Pharaoh, they get the Passover. When the Maccabean revolt occurs, what do they get? Well, they get Hanukkah. When Xerxes tries to kill the Jewish people under Esther, what do they get? They get the festival of Purim. What do we see over and over and over again? We see that God is behind the Jewish people. Will he banish them? Will he exile them? Yes, he will. Yes, he will do that. But will he always bring them back? According to Jeremiah 31, he won't unless we get rid of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Let me give you a theological argument. Ready? Was the nation of Israel judged for rejecting the Messiah as a nation? I know many Jewish people came to faith in Jesus, not the least of which the apostles, Paul, and so forth. But was the nation dispersed and judged because of their rejection of Jesus, Messiah? Luke 19, yes. The nation was judged. They were under God's curse and judgment, Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26, because they rejected the Son of God. If the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, regathered in 1948 on their own power, this would mean that even though they were under the judgment of God, they rejected that, they overpowered God himself, and they came back into their land despite God's wrath. Let me put this a little bit more simply. I reject Jesus and go to hell, but I say, "God, no, I'm going to heaven." Whomever God blesses will be blessed, and whomever God curses will be cursed. And if the nation, I'm speaking of the nation, the collective, is under God's curse, his judgment, does that mean that they can outdo God's curse and his judgment and somehow pull themselves up by their proverbial bootstraps and come back into their land? That's nonsense. That is absolute, to a biblically trained mind, that is nonsense. That didn't happen. It never happened. The Jews are there in their land to this day. How did that happen? Well, some people say this wasn't clearly predicted. Yes, it was. Pretty much every prophet, major, minor, Moses, everybody agrees that this was predicted very clearly. We have dozens of predictions about the regathering of the nation of Israel at the end of history. So, if you want to argue against what I'm saying here, it's not just Isaiah 11. It's Ezekiel 37. It's Deuteronomy 4. It's Hosea 3. There are dozens of passages you need to overturn and say those cannot refer to the regathering of Israel at the end of history. Okay. Wasn't clearly predicted? Yes, it was. Some people say the regathering of Israel wasn't a unique event. Excuse me? Okay. The complete and utter annihilation of Israel, the center of religious worship, the temple, in AD 70. The political structure was decapitated. The center of the religious worship was removed and destroyed. This happened in AD 70. It happened again in the Bar Kokhba revolt in the AD 130s. This was annihilated. Then these people, after Bar Kokhba, the Romans came in and said, if you're a Jew, you need to get out of Israel, otherwise we're going to kill you. So they were globally dispersed. How long? For 19 centuries. Let that sink in for a second. 1900 years, these people were kicked out of their homeland, no centralized worship, no centralized politician, king, priest, none of that. It's all gone for 1900 centuries. Yet they retained their ethnic and religious identity and regathered in their homeland. So when people ask, what are with those kosher laws in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14? Why is it you can eat this, but you can't eat that? And you got to have your beard trimmed a certain way. And what is with all that? Now that we look back from the perspective of 2,000 years, we see that those laws kept the Jews distinct from the cultures in which they found themselves. God had in place and implanted a particular modus operandi, an MO, method of operations, that the Jews would be distinct for 1,900 years until they would be regathered in their own homeland. Let me give you an analogy, a comparison to try and suss this out a little bit. Think of the indigenous American population. I wouldn't want to say American Indians because that would be not politically correct. But if you remember what the American Indians were, now we call them indigenous American peoples. Imagine all of the different people groups, the Iroquois, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They've been out of power in the continental United States for how long? Let's say 300 years. Let's say these people here, the native indigenous peoples in the Americas, what would be the chances that that people group, the American Indians, could kick out all of the white European people, send them back to Europe, and reclaim the continental United States? What would be the chances of that? I'm not laughing maniacally, by the way. I'm just saying that is, wow, that is very, very hard to imagine that these indigenous Native American people would be able to push all of the white people like me out of the United States and then reclaim the continental U.S. The probability of that, what I'm just describing with me, is far more probable than the regathering of the nation of Israel into their homeland. You say, how so? Because these indigenous American peoples stayed in the same territory. They weren't globally dispersed. And it was, I don't want to say only, but only for 300 years. We're talking about a global dispersion for 19 centuries and then being brought back into the same real estate 1900 years later. There's nothing like this. Here's Donald Lewis, a professor of church history. Now, he's one that's not a supporter of this idea of Zionism, as it's called. So I'm not quoting someone who's favorable. Yet, he writes, history knows of no other people whose faith and identity has survived repeated devastations and the trauma of exile, and that, not once. This didn't just happen once, where you're dispersed across the entire globe and then brought back together. This happened twice. The Babylonian exile and then the exile of the Romans in AD 70 to 135 AD. In fact, this event, what we're seeing here, so unique. Never happened before to any other nation or people group. It doesn't exist. So unique, even Christian theologians didn't see it coming in the 20th century. Just let that sink in for a second. We're going to get to how could this have been fulfilled. Even Christian theologians didn't see this coming in the 20th century. Here's Louis Berkhof. If you're in the realm of systematic theology, Louis Berkhof is considered one of the best. He wrote this, writing about all these predictions about the end of history and Israel being gathered into their land. He writes this, he says, this literalism that you're actually going to have, come on, Jewish people in the land of Israel, you really believe that? This literalism lands interpreters in all kinds of absurdities, for it involves the future restoration of all the former historical conditions of Israel's life. At this point, Berkhof is saying, in other words, they've been spread out across the globe, and now they're going to be back in their land. The altered situation would make it necessary for all the nations to visit Jerusalem from year to year in order to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Berkhof is looking at this and just saying, come on. This literalism, that this is all going to be literally fulfilled, it's absurd. When did he write that? 1939. Less than a decade later, Israel had her land back. He couldn't predict this 10 years in advance. The Bible predicted this millennia in advance. Kim Riddlebarger, he's a dude. Kim Riddlebarger, theologian, writing about this, he doesn't hold to this view either. He says, when Louis Berkhof completed his venerable systematic theology in 1939, the restoration of Israel looked like an impossibility. No kidding. Berkhof couldn't have foreseen the events of World War II, the Holocaust, and the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, and he surely overstated his case. No kidding. Even if the land promise of the Abrahamic covenant has already been fulfilled, it is quite remarkable that the Jews have returned en masse to their ancient homeland. I remember reading this book and just saying, dear, where is he going with this? He doesn't believe that this was a miracle of God. He doesn't believe that this is fulfilling Bible prophecy, even though he's a Christian theologian. He's an amillennial theologian. If you don't know what that is, it doesn't matter. The point is, he doesn't believe this is fulfilling Bible prophecy. So he's admitting Berkhof had it wrong. And this is incredible, quite remarkable. Where's he going with this? This fact is a fact that cannot be easily dismissed. Israel is a nation again. The Jews as a people are largely gathered together in one place. We need to offer a cogent or persuasive explanation for this amazing historical development. Yes, I'm right with you there, Kim. Then he says, the reforming of Israel, quote, falls within the mysterious providence of God. It's a big mystery why God would bring all the Jews back to Israel. Very mysterious. Probably to lead many Jewish people to Christ before the end of history, vis-a-vis Romans 11. But, quote, this is not connected to the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. Give me a break. This might be mysterious to Riddlebarger and Berkhof. It's not a mystery when I read my Bible. When I open up my Bible, it's clear as day that God says, I'm getting back with the Jews. I'm never abandoned. If you think that God can break his unconditional promises to the Jews, do you think as a Christian he can break his unconditional promises to you? Like the Jews, they were so sinful, they sinned their way out of God's unconditional promises. But as Christians, we're so, not sinful that we don't sin our way out of God's unconditional. No, when God makes a word and he declares that is true, that is unconditional. It can't be revoked. The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Romans 11:29. Not a mystery. Some theologians, reading their Bibles, are exceptions to this, not the least of which John Wycliffe, John Huss, Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton. He not only authored the Principia, he also authored 2 commentaries on the book of Daniel and Revelation. Yeah, the great atheist Isaac Newton. Now, he was a firm believer in Jesus, believed in prophecy, believed in the Bible. Charles Spurgeon, 5-point Reformed Calvinist. And if you don't know what that means, no big deal. Don't worry about it. The point is, in his theology, he's saying, I don't believe this, and yet I read Ezekiel 37, there it is. I read Isaiah 11, there it is. And he said, I can't get around it. If my theology tells me one thing, but this passage is telling me something else, Spurgeon, as a good interpreter, said, I got to go with the passage. Now, it befuddles me why Spurgeon didn't change his theology based on the passage. But the point is here, Spurgeon is saying, the Jews are coming back to their land. This was in the late 19th century. Huss, Wycliffe, Newton, these are all centuries before. They could read their Bibles just like we can today. And they said, Israel, the Jews, they're coming back. Other people said, this wasn't an improbable event. Yes, it was. Yes, it was. No people have been systematically brutalized, tortured, enslaved, anything you could name, any superlative you could fill in the blank, that happened to the Jews. AD 70, Josephus says 1.1 million Jews were killed during the Bar Kokhba revolt, AD 132 to 135. Dio Cassius says 500,000 Jews were killed. So think about that. 60 years later, we got another 500,000. Now, historians say Josephus was probably exaggerating. But if you're saying 1.1 million, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Jews, and then 60 years later, hundreds of thousands more killed, enslaved, raped, pillaged, everything else. They're kicked out of their land. Then we got the good, quote-unquote, Christian emperor Constantine, AD 325. The good Christian emperor says that it's illegal to convert to Judaism. In fact, if you convert to Judaism, you die. After this, I can't get into all of the details. If you read, pick up a book on Jewish persecution. I'm going to give you 2. For an example, we see just it's replete throughout history. You want to talk about a conspiracy. There's a global conspiracy why people hate the Jews so much. And we just see this throughout human history. David Rausch and Barry Horner have written 2 excellent books on this. The Legacy of Hatred, and which is why Christians must not forget the Holocaust, and Future Israel, why Christian anti-Judaism must be challenged. 2 excellent books. They go into the Russians. I hope you're not one of those people who thinks anti-Semitism began in Germany in 1939. This was throughout the centuries. On and on and on it went. Okay. We finally reached the apex in the Holocaust. 2/3 of Jews on earth rounded up, put into gas chambers, killed, burned alive. 6 million Jews by 1945. This isn't improbable. Yes, it is improbable. They faced every barrier, every opposition you could face. There it is. The Jewish people faced it. Okay. At this point, some people will say, well, maybe this was self-fulfilled. Maybe the Jews or somebody, they had the religious chutzpah, the zealousness to somehow bring their nation back together after 1900 years. The problem with this is, who self-fulfilled this? The Jews? They didn't self-fulfill this, that they got their nation back after being slaughtered on the order of 6 million people. Here's Lewis again. He says, there were a handful of deeply religious Jews in the late 19th century, 1800s. and early 20th centuries who were in favor of the Zionist cause, getting this nation back together. But they were a tiny minority. Religious Zionists were very much the exception. Before 1945, most religious Jews regarded Zionism with deep hostility. What? Jews didn't want their nation back? How do you figure? Well, they believed that only Messiah would return the Jews to their ancestral homeland. Religiosity, religious belief can inculcate a very powerful energy into its followers. This is working the opposite direction. The Jews said, Isaiah 11 says, Messiah is going to be a signal to the nations, and he's going to bring the people back. We're not going to do it. So it was a tiny minority, and the idea that we're going to self-fulfill this was met with deep hostility. It was the Holocaust that persuaded many Jews to embrace Zionism. So what did they do? This puts you into quite a pickle, as they say. Did the Jews create the Holocaust so that they could get their land back? Is that what you believe? The Zionist movement was, from its inception, secular, not religious, and largely Marxist, not religious, with few rabbis supporting the cause. Most, in fact, opposed it. There were no Orthodox rabbis who attended the first Zionist Congress in 1897 from Eastern Europe, and only 3 from the rest of Europe. Shalom Goldman, this is from his book as a professor of religion at Duke on this whole subject. He says political Zionism was founded and led by secular, non-believing Jews, and Israel's ruling elites are to this day secular. Thomas Golsky, professor of history and political science, he says Zionism remained a minority movement among Jews. They fulfilled this? They did not self-fulfill this. This wasn't a self-fulfilled prophecy because they were largely secular, and the religious ones had a religious sense that we cannot fulfill this ourselves. Only Messiah can do it. I remember talking to a guy years ago. He said, well, what would God want with a bunch of secular Jews? You know, in Israel today, 30% of the people in Israel consider themselves, quote unquote, religious. 65% today consider themselves not religious or convinced atheists. That is to say, the majority of people in Israel today don't believe in God. And these are the people that self-fulfill this prophecy. My friend said to me, what would God want with a bunch of unbelieving Jews? I said, the story isn't over. He's bringing them together. Read Ezekiel 37. First, he brings the flesh and the sinews and the skin. And at the very end, he puts his ruah, his spirit, into them. He brings them together physically, and then he brings them together spiritually, to the point where Paul can say, Romans 11, 26-ish, 27, all Israel will be saved. The nation will be saved. What about the Christians? Christians did it. Maybe we were the ones reading our Bibles, and we were the ones who did it. Again, Shalom Goldman out of Duke. He says, for the most part, Christians did not feature in this entire story except as antagonists. It's such an understatement. Read the history of the so-called Christians with regard to the Jews. Horrific. Horrific. Just, it'll make your skin crawl reading about this. Donald Lewis, he says, until the 1960s, the Roman Catholic Church wasn't even part of the story of Christian Zionism. That's after they got their nation in 1948. The standard explanation of Christian Zionism is essentially, 1, that it's American. 2, it's Darbyite in inspiration, John Darby, the father of dispensationalism in many circles. And 3, inspired by dispensational premillennialist history. You say, what is that? I'll make it real simple. It's the view that when the Bible says Israel is going to come back, Israel, the people, are literally going to come back. Lewis, not a proponent, says that it's American from John Darby and it's dispensational. This is seriously flawed on all 3 points. Guys, he's a professor of church history at Regent Theological Seminary. He's not supporting this view. He's saying that whole idea that Christians self-fulfilled this because they're reading their Bible from a dispensational view. It's just flawed. That's just not historical. That's not how it happened. Christians didn't do it. Oh, the UN, World War II, 1949 to 1945, the collective nations saw with compassion what happened to the Jews. Consequently, they gave them their land, a little section of Palestine, and then that was inflated fourfold in the Jewish War of 1967. But they gave their original plot of land in Israel from the UN to the Jews. So this is how it was self-fulfilled. The UN self-fulfilled Bible prophecy. Empires like the USSR, atheistic nations, had a vested interest in fulfilling Bible prophecy. That is a married bachelor, my friends. Atheists fulfilling Bible prophecy. And yet they voted for this. The United Nations partition plan for Palestine. This wasn't an edict. This wasn't saying that they were demanding that you give them the land. That's not what it was. But it was saying this is our advising of what should happen, and they gave it to the Jews. USSR. This is why, in case you've ever wondered, why do people deny the Holocaust? There's these conspiracy theorists who say, I remember Steven Spielberg. Remember this? Back in Schindler's List, was on the 90s. He was getting eyewitness testimony on tape. This wasn't to do with the movie, but it was in a correlation with the movie. He was getting survivors of the concentration camps, and he was bringing them in and having their eyewitness testimony filmed because he was saying people are already, within 50 years, denying that the Holocaust ever occurred in the 90s. Why would they do that? One of the premier reasons is this. How could the Jewish people get their land back in their real estate in Palestine? Unless they invented the whole Holocaust, and it was a big Holocaust hoax, and it was a big conspiracy to garner the sympathy of all the nations, and then to tell the nations, we need our own land, we're a persecuted people, we're men and women without a country. And so then the United Nations says, okay, fine, you twisted our arm, we'll put you back in Israel. That's where Holocaust conspiracy theories arise from. Michael Shermer, he's a historian of science. I believe he's Jewish. So he had a vested interest in writing this book, Denying History. He said, why, we might ask the deniers, if the Holocaust didn't happen, would any group concoct such a horrific story? This is why. Because some deniers claim there was a conspiracy of Zionists to exaggerate the plight of Jews during the war in order to finance the state of Israel through war reparations. That's why. He cites Holocaust deniers. I've not read these guys. I don't want to waste my time. But here's one example. Richard Harwood. He said the Holocaust lie was perpetuated to fill the minds of Gentile people with such guilt feelings about the Jews that they would utter no protest when the Zionists robbed the Palestinians of their homeland. Another one. Jack Wyckoff. He says Talmudic Jewry is at war with humanity. Revolutionary communism and international Zionism are twin forces working toward the same goal, a despotic world government with the capital in Jerusalem. David Irving, another Holocaust denier. Without Hitler, this is hard to even read, this is so disgusting. Without Hitler, the state of Israel probably wouldn't exist today, so that to that extent, he was probably the Jews' greatest friend. Who self-fulfilled it? It wasn't the Jews. It wasn't the Christians. It wasn't the UN. Who did it? It wasn't self-fulfilled. This was not self-fulfilled. Okay, some people at this point say, all right, this could be true, but what you're saying is, so you're one of those people politically that sides with Israel against the Palestinians. It's not my view as a Bible teacher to share my political views, and so I won't. All I'm going to say is this. This prophecy has nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Nothing. Zero. Here's why. These predictions foresee the future, but they do not cause the future. These predictions foresee the future. They know what happened, but knowing is not causing. I'd like to go back to the 2002 movie by Steven Spielberg, Minority Report, in which they have these precogs, cognitive meaning thought, and pre meaning before. They have these three precogs in the basement of this building where these time cops, led by Tom Cruise in the movie, they talk to the precogs and they get images to stop future crimes. Okay? These precogs, these psychics, so to speak, they know the future crimes. But from that, does it follow that they're causing the future crimes? How boring of a plot would it be if Minority Report was, as soon as they predict a crime, they arrest the precogs and throw them in jail? No. They know what happened, but knowing something doesn't mean that I know a lot of things. You know a lot of things in your mind. You didn't cause those things, necessarily. Second, this commits what's called in philosophy a modal fallacy. Stick with me, all right? I know you just puckered up on that. A modal fallacy, stick with me. It's going to get worse. Here it is. Necessarily, premise 1, P, then Q. Premise 2, P, therefore necessarily Q. Modus ponens. A typical, a valid, logical syllogism. You're saying, what on earth is that? Stick with me. This is a fallacy. I'm not saying modus ponens is a fallacy. That's a standard deductive form. P, then Q. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. But notice, see that little box there? In modal logic, that little box stands for necessarily. Let's see. We see that little box in premise 1. We see it in premise 3. Where is it missing? Premise 2. Necessarily, if P, then Q. P. Therefore, necessarily Q. This is a classic modal fallacy. I told you I'd help. Here we go. Ready? God knows with certainty, necessarily, that I will eat bacon and eggs tomorrow at 8:05 a.m. As it turns out, that's what I eat every morning at 8:05 a.m. I take my son to school. I make my lunch Sunday night. I have the entire bacon and eggs casserole for the week, and that's what I have every morning. But besides the point, God knows with certainty that I will eat bacon and eggs tomorrow at 8:05 a.m. He knows that. Therefore, I was determined necessarily to eat bacon and eggs tomorrow at 8:05 a.m. That's a fallacy. That's a fallacy. I hope you can see that. God knows it. That doesn't make it necessarily true. Determinism doesn't follow. All that follows from this whole syllogism is that I will eat the bacon and eggs tomorrow. Not that I was determined or fated or necessarily needed to eat the bacon and eggs. If I had chosen tomorrow to get off my low-carb diet and eat toast, then God would have known that with certainty. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. But not necessarily P, therefore Q. Now, if I had chosen to eat toast, God would have known that in advance. Let me give you an example. You're hanging out with me and you say, James, I was with you yesterday at 8:05 a.m. and I know with certainty that you ate bacon and eggs yesterday, not tomorrow, yesterday at 8:05 a.m. I was there with you. So, what's your point? Therefore, you were determined necessarily to eat bacon and eggs yesterday at 8:05. You see the problem? Knowing is not causing. Knowing doesn't make it a necessary truth. All it is that it is true, not necessarily true. Hope you can follow that. If it works in the past that it's not necessarily true, I could have chosen something else, then it must work in the future as well. Finally, God can and does use sinful means to bring about his ends. I'm not going to stand up and stick up for everything that the nation of Israel has done since May of 1948. I'm not going to do that. That's not the focus of this discussion. What I will say is this. Let's agree that the nation of Israel has done sinful, evil things like every other nation. Can we agree on that? The question is, so what? Does God draw a straight line with a crooked stick? Yeah, I'm a crooked stick up here. I see a lot of crooked sticks out there. God can bring about His Great Commission through people like us. God can bring about the future predictions through people like us. The same thing is true here. God can bring about the restoration of the Jewish people under Joseph through his 11 evil brothers. God can bring about the salvation of humanity through evil and wicked people like Herod and Pontius Pilate and the religious leaders. And He can bring about the Great Commission through evil, wicked people like us.